Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the RESI 2019 Digital Health panel. The theme for this morning's panel is all about value in digital healthcare and really looking at how the investments we make and the work that our entrepreneurs are leading can support this industry with driving costs down, improving health outcomes, and increasing engagement with patients. So the format we'll run, we'll go for about 40 minutes. Hopefully we'll have some agreements and some disagreements here. And we'll then follow through, we'll open up the floor to questions. Also shout out, Jessica just walked out, so Jessica Young, she's been tremendously helpful, working hard behind the scenes to get us all up and running for today's panel. So we're very grateful. So my name is Raman Rafai. I'm a Director of Digital Healthcare at SHL Group. We're world leaders in the design, development and manufacturing of advanced drug delivery systems for self-administration. And our digital healthcare strategy is very much an extension of our core. And we're really focused on the next generation of drug delivery, one that's going to be data-driven, personalised and outcomes-based. So on to the panel. If I can ask, panel members to introduce themselves. Elaine, would you like to tell us a little bit about yourself, your firm, and sort of what subsectors of digital health take your interest?
Hello, my name's Elaine Moe. I'm with Ascend Capital Partners, and we are a global VC company. So we have offices I'm based in New York. We also have offices in London, Munich, Luxembourg, Finland, Hong Kong, New Zealand, and China. So we are very global, just by definition, geographical location. The types of companies that we're looking at are on the diagnostic space. So that can be with hardware solutions or software solutions. Anything that helps the clinicians or practitioners do their job more effectively and efficiently.
Wonderful. Sarah Sassong. I have been at Flair Capital Partners, which is a Boston-based venture capital firm focusing on health tech and tech-enabled services. I've been there about 16 months. Prior to that, I spent 15 years in health systems as an operator and innovator launching digital health programs. So in the Navy, Kaiser Permanente, and most recently at Mass General Hospital and Partners. So since being at Flair, it has been interesting to see the other side of what happens when you're in the hospital. It never occurred to me where a startup came from before they came to our doors. So we are investing in health tech-enabled services. We're generally writing checks for $3 to $6 million. We're looking for things that are transforming the business of healthcare. So we're very keen on things that are enabling risk or enabling other organizations to take on risk. We just closed our second fund of $255 million and have made 2 investments out of that now.
Good, thank you. And Saeed?
Hi, good morning everyone. My name is Sohaib Siddiqui. I'm part of Kettlebike Ventures, which is actually a family office based out of Toronto, Canada. We do a lot of things, health is one of them. So we primarily make revenue from real estate and banking actually. So we take that revenue and we diversify it and created sort of a family fund within our group where we broadly invest in technologies. I drive the healthcare strategy in-house, so I'm a doc by trade, background in clinical research, biology and life sciences. So essentially what we're trying to do with our fund is make strategic investments in healthcare. Basic premise is, as a clinician, I want companies that reduce morbidity and mortality, increase access to care, and reduce cost in healthcare. Those are the general metrics that we want to do. We're very active in the digital health space. We find it's a good bang for our buck. A little bit med devices, but I'd say 90% in digital health. And typically you'll write check sizes upwards of about 1 to 2 million or so.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Wasim Malik. I'm a managing partner at ISO Ventures. My background is in electrical engineering, neuroscience, and then working in several startups as a founder, executive, and then in investing. Most recently, I ran the digital health corporate VC group at Robin Sciences, which is a New York-based biopharma company. And then earlier this year, we launched ISO Ventures, which is a new sector-focused health tech or digital health VC firm. It's sector-focused because we primarily look at things related to the brain, which we believe is the next frontier for innovation and for generating ROI for investors. So that includes neurotechnology, behavioral health, and mental health. We have a very investor-operator kind of model, so very hands-on in building ventures, helping companies grow, not just investing and sitting back waiting for returns, but really taking on operating roles for which we have put together a big team with a diverse operating background. And lastly, we work with very early stage companies, starting from concept stage pre-seed all the way to late Series A or some opportunistic Series B, all in the digital health and health tech space.
Great, thanks, Wasim. So just to kick off this panel, really, there's a number of themes that we want to cover. And the first one is around the adoption of digital health technologies. So before I stepped into the healthcare industry, I was in autonomous mobility, and we saw, a convergence of factors such as, electrification, shared economy, and autonomous mobility. It was really, starting to transform the automotive industry. In digital healthcare, we also see that there are a number of factors that are converging, that are sort of accelerating the adoption of these technologies among all stakeholders. And the first, and I think the most trivial one, is really around Moore's Law. And what we saw with Moore's Law, with computers and sensors shrinking, we saw a lot of smartwatches come on the market. And that's really, the space of monitoring. But now what we're seeing is that these sensors and computers are now going into diagnostic devices, and most recently into treatment devices, right? So this itself is going to have a number of ramifications for the whole industry. The second one I want to touch on is around regulation. I think the FDA has been quite proactive with the software pre-certification program, and most recently, in my opinion, most interestingly, is the recent discussion paper they put out around artificial intelligence and machine learning. So if you have a good look at that paper, the FDA is trying to get its head around how do we regulate probabilistic code, right? So if we think so far, everything we've had, every bit of software we've written for medical devices and procedures in the healthcare system is deterministic, simple logic. But what about when software is teaching itself and is learning? And finally, is around adoption by alignment, and this is alignment of incentives. If you look at the CMS, they've been championing value-based care, and most recently this year we saw the 2019 reimbursement codes for remote care. So now data that is collected, and I just want to make a differentiation here, remote care is not telehealth, right? So here it's specifically data that's collected from these monitoring and diagnostic devices and then analyzed while the patient is away from the clinic, right? All in all, and also if you look across the pharmaceutical space, right? So I think pharma's a big player in the adoption of digital health technologies, and we should not. We should take notice of the fact that pharma is now adopting value-based contracts, and digital healthcare will be an enabler for these value-based contracts, which are very much, we're going to take risk, we're going to share the risk, therefore we need to each produce the evidence, and it's through connectivity and digitization that you can produce that evidence. So I want to come back to our panelists. Really what I'm interested, perhaps we can start with you, Sarah, given that you've been in, prior to stepping into investment, you were part of Kaiser, and you've been walked the corridors of the health systems. Where do you see the opportunities for impact in the health system with digital technologies, and has that experience of being part of the health system changed the way you look at or evaluate the investment opportunities that are presented to you?
So I think first, for any of you that are entrepreneurs in the room, you probably know that health systems are the slowest customers to interact with, very long sales cycles, very little willingness to pay. I know when I was at Mass General, as a rule, I would negotiate to pay nothing because the value of what we did in coordination with the partnerships we had was often very enabling for those companies. But I think coming from the health system side of things, I think really understanding what the hospital challenges and needs are, coming from the places where I have, and I think this is pretty common everywhere, is balancing the need for revenues with the implementation of the ACA. I think unless you're a Kaiser or a few other systems, really while you have a certain number of patients under risk, the majority of your revenues are likely coming from fee-for-service. So things that can help solve that challenge for hospital systems. Also access is a huge problem. A couple of the technologies that were particularly successful at Mass General were video visits into the home and second opinions. Video visits solved the problem of access for patients who were coming from far distances or needed very frequent follow-ups. For second opinions, again, solved the problem of being able to provide Mass General's specialty services to patients, whether they were in Boston, California, or China, or anywhere else around the world. And ultimately, we put all these programs together in a way that was able to provide a continuum of care. So I think, coming from the health system, I work with a team of seven other investors, and we all, while there are 2 long-time healthcare investors who launched the fund, the rest of us have various operating backgrounds. I'm the only one with a specific provider background, and I think the biggest thing has been really understanding what is the impact of the workflow on the people that will ultimately have to use it. I think very often there are companies with great ideas, great potential market size, but if you can't get people to actually use it and integrate it into the day-to-day behavior, it's really not going to be something that's adopted. And I think oftentimes people will tell us the number of patients that they have under contract, and I'll ask, how many actual users and what's your actual volume? So really understanding what is the utilization. And to that point, I would say, really suggest partnering with provider systems early on. And a mix of provider systems. Getting that early feedback is really essential. While ultimately payers and employers and pharma may be the better, more lucrative long-term customers, if you need to have the buy-in early on.
Absolutely, and I think you touched on a very important point, and that is really, becoming part of the clinical pathway, that clinical integration. Because I think, especially if you come from the technology side, you're generally, I would say, more obsessed with the functions and the features and the capability of the technology, and it becomes very easy to neglect the challenges at the customer side, right? And how is it that they're going to leverage this technology to improve their processes and procedures? So, Sahib, if I can sort of ask you to step in, given that you've got medical training and you've been practicing as a physician and now as an investor, how do you see the opportunities in the sort of care provider space?
Right. So it's a it's a tricky business, right? And I think both of you, Sarah and Raheem, you brought up the issue of how to integrate it into the healthcare system. I think a lot of startups over-engineer things and they don't properly understand the clinical workflow. I mean, you've kind of mentioned it. But I think it's very, very important for any entrepreneur, any startup to really have an intimate understanding of that clinical workflow. Because docs, nurses, dietitians, they're a stubborn group of people. They have a very set way of how things are supposed to be done. There are royal colleges that basically give you algorithms of how you're supposed to do things. Anytime you bring in a technology, even if it's adding one extra button to turn on that machine, that is it's a detour that they're not used to doing. So you have to be mindful of that. And I bring this button as an example. I've actually had debates with startups like, why do we need to push a button to turn it on? Like literally, people have had arguments about buttons. So I think really the opportunity is to understand the workflow, have an intimate understanding of how that surgery is done, how that remote care monitoring is done, and how do we integrate your technology seamlessly and just efficiently. You have to make daily life for doctors easy, or hospitals easy. I think you also need to understand the healthcare economics of the technology that you bring into it. So many times I see, coming into the investor side of things now, I see so many pitch decks on a weekly basis, and everyone talks about the total addressable market of a particular issue. Take chronic disease or heart disease. Total addressable market is $10 billion. That's a great number, but how much of that chunk are you actually going to be able to decipher from your technology? That's a number that very few startups actually know. You can't afford to do a health economic study, especially early on, but having a sense of, if I deployed my app, dollar to dollar, day by day, how much money can, a system like Mass General, or Kaiser Permanente, or a little rural clinic, how much money can they save? So I think those are two really key things you have to pick up on.
Fantastic. Wasim, let's say you have a fantastic company that they've pitched you an amazing technology. What is it that you look for, right? So how do you evaluate that opportunity given the complexities of the landscape we're in, right? We're both, digital healthcare being both technology and healthcare. So how do you evaluate that opportunity?
Let me relate this to the point that Sohaib and Sarah just made, which was about understanding workflows. So one of the first things we look at is how does that technology or product fit into the existing workflows, or how much do they make people change their habits. So if it's a play for providers, it has to solve, not only has it got to improve the workflow that already exists, but not make anyone push an extra button or click another checkbox. That's very critical. It's one of the first things. If it's a consumer play, there have been probably over 100 watches of different design bands or whatever. But how many people wear them? Stickiness has always been a problem. So increasingly, we are looking at so-called invisibles that just sit somewhere in the background, and people don't have to do anything. Especially, my firm looks at a lot of solutions for people who have dementia, for example, or other aging conditions. There it's critical that an 85-year-old person doesn't have to click a few buttons on the app every morning. It just should be something that stays in the background. So there's that point about the workflow and how the product fits in the market it's addressing. Let me also get to a couple of other points related to the technology or product itself, and then the monetization of it. So on the tech front, I personally get excited by things which are boring and unsexy because they solve real problems. And I'll give you an example. Sarah was speaking about some of the work that has come out of Mass General on telehealth that I think has been a major success in digital health. Mass General has also been an investor in Health Catalyst, which has been one of the biggest digital health IPOs this year. For disclosure, I'm an advisor to Health Catalyst. That's just a data warehousing solution. Nothing more, nothing fancy, no fun NLP going on that data, just warehousing. But that has created a lot of value because that warehousing and data structure definitions, a little bit of data science, all of that has huge value for the healthcare systems that it serves. So that's the bit about the technology and the problem it solves, not the new shiny gizmos, but what is the boring back-end solution that it provides. The other aspect is about the business models that are tied to how you monetize that product. And we have seen in the digital health market that for many years now, defining the right business model and revenue model has been a challenge. That has affected some of the valuations we see. So on one hand, take the example of digital therapeutics. Very large valuations right now, pretty frothy in my opinion, but no clear revenue models that you can say would be sticky and those products would be around for the next 10 years. And I understand this is still very new, so some of those things will evolve. But when it comes to establishing the credibility of a product to investors or stakeholders that might be doctors, it's very important to understand where exactly is the value being driven, and that's translating that into the bottom line of the business. That's critical.
Very interesting.
Could I add one thing to that too? It is also just the value of the team. I think what as I've advised startups coming in to pitch to us, put the team slide on literally the first slide. Establish your credibility. What have you done before? If you're an established entrepreneur, we would then understand that you know how to evolve the business model. You know how to evolve the product. We are early stage investors, so we and stage agnostic. The majority are A's and B's, but we did do 4 seeds, and those were basically blank checks we wrote to established entrepreneurs. So we just seeded a new company called Talsite with David Ting, who is the former founder and CTO of Imprivata. And so, knowing that the team is someone that can really do this, the product will probably evolve dramatically and the services will evolve dramatically. So to the extent that you have relevant background for you or the team, that's really important to highlight too.
All right, thanks, Sarah. Elaine, you mentioned your global footprint. I heard many different countries. How has having that global footprint sort of influenced your decisions in digital healthcare, your investment decisions? Because I'm personally very US focused. I see the US market having a tremendous opportunity for transformation. When you look beyond the US borders, do you evaluate opportunities differently depending on the geographic region of the country?
Yeah, I think a hot topic in healthcare, and you touched upon this as well, is the idea of telehealth. The global trend is that, practitioners, not that many people are going into medicine, or this certain specialties are kind of dying off, like radiology, pathology. So the need for telehealth in those areas is very prevalent. Additionally, not everybody is located in a big city like Boston or Miami or New York City. So how do you help those regions that aren't a rural popular region and that people can't afford to go to a large city that's, whether it's a few minutes away by drive or a few hours by flight, that's a huge issue. So you kind of look into the idea of like telehealth and how not only can you centralize care and say centralized labs, but how can you spread out these technologies so that people in, say, Inner Mongolia can access the same healthcare. And then additionally, one of the side projects of our CEO is a charitable foundation that helps children and their families to get readily accessible and affordable care, especially for their children with like leukemia or other terminal illnesses. So that's kind of a lens that we put on for our potential investments as well. But I do have to say it's also a lot of the unsexy type of companies that we look at, because a lot of people are looking at apps or wearables that we as consumers can use, and that's great and that's very valuable. But what about helping the struggling doctors that are in appointments like from 8 a.m. to 8 p.m. and then at the end of the day, they still have to write up the charts, update their reports, and stuff like that. So understanding the pain points of those users, and those are the consumers or the customers that we want to help, because I think they can be often overlooked.
Fantastic, and I actually do want to add one statistic to the point you made around telehealth. There was a McKinsey report that recently came out that actually showed that the adoption of telehealth services is starting to show an exponential trend. So that'll be very interesting to follow. So I want to talk a little bit more about, I guess, some of the unsexy stuff. And this is really a reflection on us as investors. If you look across the investment theses that have been followed in the digital health space, it seems to be that a lot of the sort of low-hanging fruit has either been funded or will be funded. So if you then start sort of digging a little bit deeper and you look at areas such as, let's say, rare diseases, the area of supporting patients with rare diseases, disabilities, marginalised communities. I must admit that perhaps us investors have let the digital health entrepreneurs down. So I really want to sort of open it up to the panel. Perhaps we can start with you, Sohaib, if you could speak to that. What if I am now an entrepreneur who, with a much greater risk appetite, very purpose-driven, how would you look at that opportunity?
Yeah, that's a really interesting, issue, and I think I agree with you. Some of these other ancillary markets have just been continuously overlooked. I think part of it, I'm going to initially start out as a comment. I think digital health market has sort of approached its space kind of like pharma. See, pharma traditionally always approaches drug development based on what are the low-hanging fruits. Because it costs a lot of money to develop drugs, right? Typically, we all know the stats, it's about $1 billion for a drug. 9 out of 10 of them will fail, so technically it's about $10 billion to bring one successful drug to market. Digital health companies have kind of done the same. Like, what are the low-hanging fruits? Diabetes, heart disease, depression, mental health. These are sort of the big buckets. These are mainstays and bread and butter issues that we have. But some of the smaller issues, relatively smaller issues, we've kind of overlooked. But I'm starting to see a bit of a transition now in that space. Actually, just yesterday I spoke to a company that's digital health focused and only targeting rare diseases. And I think the major trend now is that computing power of a lot of these digital health startups, AI, natural language processing, you're actually able to efficiently start to tackle those rare diseases, right? Where if I was just a pharmaceutical company, and if I had $1 billion to invest, I would go for the easy things. But technology can now enable you to tackle those really difficult issues more efficiently, more cost effectively. So like there's one company I met yesterday based in Toronto called 123 Genetics. They're targeting rare diseases, rare cancers, and pediatrics. Pediatrics, rare diseases, these are buckets that no one typically touches. Like that's just not even a thing. So I think, things are changing. I think investors also need to be a little bit more, I would say, well-versed with these sort of unconventional buckets. I think there's a lot of noise in digital health, and I think investors sort of get lost in the field of a million apps. So I think the onus is on the investors as well to just be, ask consultants, ask doctors, ask nurses, PhDs, what are the real issues? So it kind of goes both ways.
If I could make 2 points. One, I slightly disagree with the fact that all the low-hanging fruit has been addressed. I think the areas of investment have very much followed where there is reimbursement. So in the telehealth world, for example, broadly, the telehealth companies that are doing synchronous video have gotten a lot of investment. I think American Well has gotten almost $500 million and is poised for an IPO. But the asynchronous modalities are often much more efficient, solve the problem of access much more quickly, keep patient care within the PCP's office. So there are opportunities there, but it's just that only 3 states actually cover reimbursement for asynchronous. So I think as the regulatory landscape continues to change, there are other low-hanging fruit to address. And then second, on the issue of these sort of marginalized spaces, I think sitting in the investor seat, ultimately we have investors. So we have, while we're an institutional investor, 2/3 of our investors are strategics. So we have payers, providers, pharma, and they are ultimately looking for a return on their investment. This is also deal flow for them, but at the end of the day, we have to return an investment. And we're looking for things to be a 10x investment, because knowing that it will likely be between a 2 to 5x. So I think in looking at these niche areas, it's hard to see how that will be $1 billion business, and I think that's been part of the challenge. What I've really encouraged entrepreneurs that are focusing in more niche spaces to think about is, that's definitely a way to get a foot in the door and to establish a platform, but think about what is the platform, what's the service, what's the long-term enterprise approach, because no health system wants to have a separate tool for Crohn's versus a pediatric subspecialty problem. So I think really thinking about what is the pathway for making this a multi-specialty platform and service that can address other issues, and figure out what's the short-term niche. But I think it's hard to think about building an investor funded business. It's really big in some of these areas.
Thanks, Sarah. You mentioned IPOs, so I think that's good. In the interest of time, that's a good segue. So we had 4 IPOs in the digital health space this year. Put your hand up if anyone's read any S1s. All right. So I've had a look at all of them, and Livongo is by far, in my opinion, the best written S1. Personally, there was a lot that I learned just from reading inside. So if you are a digital health entrepreneur, S1's a great source of learning about a digital healthcare business. So it's great reading material. Also, if you have a look at the sort of the investments in the VC investments in 2019, it's very much shadowing the 2018 investments. There almost appears not to be a shortage of capital. So really, my question for the panel, and perhaps Wasim, if you'd like to kick this off, are we in an investment bubble? Is there an over-evaluation? Is there too much money? Is there too little money? And where is the money going?
Yes. So, so I think it's pretty clear to everyone right now, both in the private markets and public markets, that we are in a major investment bubble right now. And this only reminds me, I'm old enough that I used to work in the Silicon Valley in the dot-com days. And I think we are hitting those levels if you look at PEs and all the other fundamentals. Those do not support the valuations we have today in the digital health market. So that's obviously a concern that's affecting some of the investors to hold on to the dry water and let the market correct itself a little bit. And I think some of us are expecting that correction to happen within a few months time frame, or a year or two time frame. And that could be a good 10 to 20% correction in the private market space. It's obviously much harder to assess exactly and quantify how much that correction should be, what the right valuations level should be. But I think our approach is to look right down to the business models, to the revenue models, and see if there is a real chance of adoption of the business by whatever the target market is, and what the price points would be, and other things. So here I want to draw a distinction between the East Coast and the West Coast, and I think it's pretty clear that as you travel westward, valuations start getting much higher multiples. That's something that we look very carefully at. Our firm actually has been very successful in fishing good deals away from both coasts, and in other regions of the country, from the Midwest to the South to the Southwest, where there is a lot of good stuff coming out. It just doesn't get the hype and the press, especially the hype that the West Coast creates around things that don't necessarily have any stickiness in the long run. But I think there is a need for waiting to find the right value in the right deals.
I would also say that, yeah, sure, we can call it a bubble or valuations are growing, but I know for me, I don't care if there's a bubble because, okay, other valuations are growing, but if it's too high and if the CEO knows that, then you can kind of almost penetrate through that cloud of BS, and you can reason with them as to why your valuation shouldn't be this high. And it can just be as simple as, okay, well, you said your valuation was, say 14 million, 12. And that's actually happened before, literally faced in a meeting, she's like, okay, we can do that. It's just a simple negotiation tactic, but I would just say to entrepreneurs that, yes, you're operating in a so-called bubble, but be in your own bubble and create your own type of meaning and reasoning as to why your valuation is such. I wouldn't care about what your competitors are valuing themselves at. Yeah, that's a good benchmark, but you also have to provide evidence behind that as to why you are at such a valuation.
I think that one thing that's been helpful for me is understanding the real implications of overvaluation for future rounds, which I think both of you have spoken to. But there was a company that we took a look at called Call9. They had almost national presence. They were providing telemedicine services into nursing homes. Just huge revenues, huge potential, huge customer base. And because their Series B had been 50 million, say, and then they were raising another 15, because their post money on their previous round had been 50, they just thought that they needed to increase the valuation by another 20 million to justify the progress that they'd made during their Series B development. And ultimately, they couldn't get a single investor. We were poised to write a check, but just couldn't come to terms with the valuation. They found the same thing with world-class investors across the country. And ultimately, they folded. several months ago. And so I think the fact that by the time they tried to backtrack from their valuation expectations, it was too late, and really there were other questions that had been addressed. So I think about the very real risk that it would be too difficult to raise capital in the next round, depending on what the level of valuation is.
And you make a great point, and also, you know, folding that onto sort of Elaine's comments, evaluation, show me the evidence, right? So if you have meetings outside right now, the majority of I would say the entrepreneurs attending Resi come from the life sciences sector, and in the life sciences sector, evidence is a very familiar concept. In the digital health sector, because it is a very much technology-driven, demonstrating and showing evidence is largely a foreign concept. So what we're seeing with the recent sort of consolidation across the industry is that stakeholders want to see evidence. Now this is when it comes to outcomes, they want to see unbiased clinical evidence. For cost, they want to see evidence, and for adoption, they want to see evidence. So. And just as a point of reference, there was a 2019 Nature Digital Medicine article came out. I'm just going to read the title. It says, Digital Health, a Path to Validation. For digital health solutions to have greater impact, quality and value must be easier to distinguish. So if you kind of look at the data is actually quite scary. So out of the hundreds, just look at diabetes, for example. Out of the hundreds of diabetes apps that are available today on the market, you can download them from you know the Apple and Google stores. What we see, only 11 of them have evidence of clinical studies, and only 5 demonstrate clinical outcomes, specifically in diabetes improvements in A1C. So out of hundreds, you only got 5 apps that have demonstrated clinical outcomes. So I'm sort of going to pass this on to the panel, and the question I'm going to ask, maybe Elaine, if you'd like to kick off, is what evidence do you look for, right? So you talked about high valuations or low valuation, but what is the evidence you look for in digital health?
Well, I'll start out with evidence of the team, actually. I think that's very important. Even just at the name of digital health company, you hit 3 industries right there. Digital, software, computer scientists, software engineers. Health, you have your medical experts. Companies, you have the business aspect. So the team has to have actually quite a good balance of all 3, especially in the digital and health side. And for investors, that's kind of we come in with the business side. So I think that's very important in terms of what we look at for our companies. In addition to just their skills as a person or their success as a company, but it's also the personality match because we are quite hands-on investors. So we work closely with their CEOs and their management team I call my CEOs probably on like a weekly basis just to talk with them and get some status updates. And if I find that I can't work with them, that's an issue. Additionally, in addition to that team, it's also the governance team. So looking at the other board of directors or other investors. So we like to have allies on our team, on our board. And if it's not necessarily that we agree on everything, but that we can have a healthy disagreement because, since we are an international firm and even within the US, there are a lot of cultural differences that people can, lose respect and friendships and values over. So I think it's very important that the board is aligned, maybe not at the end goal strategically, but even like morals and values, something as simple as such.
So hey, you're a medical doctor. What evidence do you look for in startups?
Yeah, so I think the evidence component for digital health is really key because I think you kind of alluded it to, in like diabetes is a perfect example. There's so much noise in the background in digital health. I think part of the problem and the opportunity with digital health is that it's very easy to get into it, right? I mean, I won't say very easy, but it's easier to get into a digital health kind of space. Like if some of you have some time this afternoon, we could whip up an app or something and start, distributing it to users. But transitioning that into actual healthcare outcomes and actually driving clinical decision making, that's a very, very nuanced, very, very highly sophisticated thing. I don't like the fact that a lot of digital health entities don't touch the FDA. A lot of, and this could probably be a point of contention, and I'd love to discuss it, but when I look at digital health companies, I really want to see them touching the FDA in some capacity. Because that not only provides validity to the concept, but I think it provides a degree of IP protection. Because a lot of digital health companies don't have IP behind it, right? It's just, we have our secret sauce, our algorithm engineers have it somewhere stored in the Google Cloud somewhere, and that's our thing, right? But having FDA approval is sort of some defensible entity. So I look for FDA touch points. I actually look for clinical evidence. You know, is your app or your software or your trackable entity actually delivering, you know, discernible clinical outcomes? I want to see reduce morbidity, reduce mortality, reduce costs, or increase access, like Sarah was talking about a lot of the telehealth components. So that's kind of where I come from.
And I would say very practically, how I agree with everything you both have said. Very practically, as a startup with 10 or fewer employees, you don't have access to the clinical data. How do you do that? I would say one thing is identify early partners who are really committed to identifying those outcomes and partnering with you and allowing you to share that data in a de-identified way with future customers. I think many health system customers, for example, are under just as much pressure as you are to demonstrate outcomes in order to maintain their budgets for the next year. So find those early partners, and then as you build, think about having someone on the team that could even be a coordinator around the data and the metrics, because ultimately to sell to the 10th and 20th health system, you're going to have to be able to show that this is repeatable over multiple customers.
Absolutely, and I think when you think about gathering clinical evidence, partnerships are is key, because if you're going to run a randomized control trial to demonstrate the efficacy of an intervention, a software-based intervention, it's an expensive exercise. So as an example, SHL, we've partnered up with a connected therapeutics company in New York, Queer Technologies. And we've recently initiated a type 2 diabetes phase 1 randomized control trial where the interventions, both the behavioral interventions, but also the titration of the patient through their treatment is done now remotely. So we've just started this process, and hopefully at the next RESI we can share the results with you. So I've just sort of been notified that we're going to open up the floor to our entrepreneurs and investors in the room. So please just introduce yourself, your firm, and we'll be happy to take your questions. Yes.
Hi, Bobby Reddy from Gnosis. Have you guys dealt with some companies for additional adoption where you did some sort of benefit sharing with hospitals, where the risk of that is less and the company only gets paid if there's a benefit? Do you have any advice along the lines of that?
Well, short answer is no, we haven't dealt with it, but we're looking at that kind of in a different way. So philanthropy is quite important, even to small, investment companies like us. So we're looking at how they can work with larger like NGOs, say like Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, of donating one of their devices or their software agreement and helping them with their strategy and their overall goal. Specifically, because I mentioned telehealth is really important. One of our pilot projects for our portfolio companies is detecting malaria in like Zimbabwe and Tanzania. So I think there's a twofold business outcome for that. One is that they can prove to a large organization like Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation that their product can be used actually in the field. And then also it just makes you feel better as a human that you're contributing to a greater cause, a greater good.
I think from Claire's perspective, so much of what we look for in terms of investment is around something, again, that's going to be a huge transformational business. And I think it's hard to do that selling widgets or a service. So I think what you're getting at, too, is how do you do revenue sharing or savings
Yeah, I mean, like if your end goal is to charge per patient or charge per year, and it makes sense, I don't know, without seeing the clinical evidence or whatever, I don't want to do that. Maybe that's a way, to get your first
Right.
revenue.
Well, actually, I think the biggest opportunities for digital health are really in cost avoidance and improving quality. So, if we think about how big that opportunity is, you're never going to be able to have a per patient cost that's going to get big enough to really get to that $1 million of savings that the hospital is having. So, I've seen companies more often in year 1 or 2 have a per patient cost, but really do a 50% sharing on what the savings are. So they look at the prior year's cost for a particular population, and then look at what it is in the year that this solution was implemented. I think it's always hard because you have to isolate for other things that are also happening, which is really hard to do, but it's possible. But I think that's absolutely, what hospitals are interested in. If you can reduce costs, then fantastic, and that's a huge opportunity for them. And if it's a way to also lower the per patient or per member cost. So, and I think from an investor standpoint, again, thinking about what's a big business, you can't build a big business on ultimately a per encounter sort of model. So we think of really transforming the ultimate opportunity through risk sharing is really the pathway to the biggest businesses.
But as a long-term business model, doing risk sharing.
Yes, absolutely.
And also don't neglect the fact that there is also opportunity if you support your customer to engage in risk-sharing models. So if you can support pharma or providers to engage in value-based care or value-based contracts, there is a business there for digital health companies. Right? Because the whole premise of digital health is the ability to measure and gather evidence.
Let me give one example. I'm also on the faculty at Mass General Hospital. One of the things that we have recently been working on is connecting the dots with the value-based reimbursements. The CAR-T treatments that are very expensive right now, several $100,000, with rather high incidence of adverse events. So we've been noticing that in our cancer center. One of the internal innovation mechanisms that was developed was to have an alert system that would generate an alert after discharge if the person goes home and a month later they have a severe adverse event. The alert would inform their attending or their specialist instead of the usual route that someone goes home and then they have an adverse event and they call up or don't call up the doctor, and that can result in anything, even death sometimes. Obviously, the bottom line of the provider is affected by that too, which should be a smaller concern, but really saving lives is important. The alternative is that if there is a risk assessed by the specialist, the person is just kept in the hospital, which is, again, very expensive. So I think that connects the dots with some of the things that have been said on trying to identify models where there is a cost avoidance instead of charging extra. And that's where there are a lot of potential opportunities.
Great. One more question. Yes.
Hi, Sully Malik. What are some digital health companies in the space that excite you from the investor's perspective? Anyone that's catching your eye as an early stage startup, an interesting model or a problem that they're working on?
I can start with that.
We're all a little bit biased.
I'll give you good news and bad news, and I'll start with the bad news first. So that's just why not. So if you look at the world of digital health, and I sort of define digital health more broadly to also include, wearables and a little bit of medtech and platforms and so on. So there's been a lot of hype in the market, and if you look at the last 3 years of papers in Nature and Lancet, pretty much every month there is a new paper on the application of AI to some problem, usually computer vision, but also all sorts of other things. There's a whole cottage industry of that now. All of them would demonstrate over 95% specificity and sensitivity. How many of them have you actually seen adopted in clinics? I don't see many. When I go to my doctor at arguably the country's best hospital, they don't use any of those AI things to look at my x-rays or whatever else. So There is a difference between those proof of concept studies that get into academic papers and also generate a lot of hype from investors. But bridging the gap between that and clinical adoption, I think that's where a lot of those things are failing right now. So that's the bad news. The good news is that I'm particularly interested in solutions that cater to identifying the right stakeholders. So we've talked about providers, we've talked about consumers a little bit. I like models where the customer can be pharma if possible, because the sales cycles are slightly faster, the pockets are deeper, and if there is demonstration of value, then those contracts get cleared. Followed by that, there are providers. Payers are a pretty slow industry, so consumers are my least favorite. But in all of these things, I think there's been some work on identifying where the key value drivers are for business and therefore generating ROIs. Some of those areas, in my thesis at least, include things that are related to connecting clinical trials faster. I think there was a McKinsey report that stated there's about a $5 million cost per day that a clinical trial goes longer, so there's huge ROI there to be captured. The other category I would mention is the space of biomarkers, and particularly digital biomarkers or digital endpoints, both for providers and pharma. I think in oncology, CNS and cardiovascular at least, there's been a lot of work calculating numbers even as high as more than 50% productivity of trials based on better digital biomarkers.
Thank you.
I would also, I've talked about asynchronous telehealth tools as one. I would say also women's health, everything from fertility to pregnancy to menopause. It's been seen as a niche industry, but it's poised to be $50 billion by 2025. And women are the primary decision makers, and there are many other implications. So I would highlight that too. I think you're also asking for specific companies. So I would say Hazel Health is one that I have really loved and watching. They provide school-based primary care and specialty care services to kids, but using the school-based setting as the locus of care. So they're now rolled out in California, Nevada, and Texas. And I think to your point, they originally had revenue, just a straight PMPM, have moved to revenue sharing. But really, I think that the potential to impact kids' health across the country, you have to go to where the kids are, and I think they're doing that in a very interesting way.
Great. So if you can just, if you could join me, thank the panelists, and thank you.